pretty much bigger than me usually. But I'm faster, so you know,
I already picked on
it works out.
I already picked on Maureen, so I can't. It's not fair.
Pretty
All right,
much bigger than
so
me usually.
all right, so now that we've warmed up,
But I'm fast.
what's the first question? Okay, for the audience, what we do with the Q&A is
I'll just send out the link.
what?
I'll just send out the link.
Okay, so what happens is people submit questions. We have a form. People submit questions. We solicit them. People submit them. Hello, Brandon. And then we collect them and curate them. Francis does have to curate them, apparently.
just a smidge.
Just a smidge. And then Martin goes through and answers most of them, and then anything I can add my 2 cents on. We go forward. So today's we've got too many questions today. So can we kick off with the first one? And Martin, if you could like pretend you're having to shout or something to an audience, that would be really useful. Apparently.
Well, I probably do have to shout. So you want the guy with a Slavic accent to read the questions again, right?
Well, I don't care. I'll read the questions. I don't care. What do you want to do? You want me to read them? I'll read them.
If the audience is. When did the post-war strategy begin and conclude, and how does it contrast with the approaches of traditional empires? Although the US spent significantly on this approach, so too did nations like Britain, France, and the Soviet Union on their respective empires. Might one perceive the prohibition of empires as a tactic by the US to restrict rivals from forming their own empires, thereby maintaining American dominance with its North American empire and vassals in Western Europe and East Asia? And we've already had an argument in answers unread.
All right.
Just go ahead and read it. So, first I said, this and some following questions will show the schism between Curt and me, which I suspect might have been the goal here. The individual asking the questions is representing my stance and the stance of much of the right wing, as in dissident right. Even if one were to accept justifications of moral high ground that this is about getting rid of empires completely and America turning into a global empire brings some sort of unexpected side effect, which is extremely dubious. It's not at all clear getting rid of empires is a moral good for the world. Many nations were better off as protectorates of larger empires, and competition between them can produce better outcomes by various metrics than monopoly of one or two that get to impose values and policies completely out of line with human nature and nature in general. Give me back Habsburgs any day. And then Curt responds, Andre, I can't argue with my.
I'll respond. I gotta find it though. Where's the first one?
Yes.
All right. So there's. I got more out of Martin reading it this time than I did out of the first time I read it. So there's basically a couple of premises in there I'll take issue with. One is that an empire is a via positiva organization, which says you must. And federation is a via negativa organization that says you may not. So what the US is trying to do is, in the post-war era, is end the age of empires. Because empires have to war continuously over control over trade routes and control over resources. And if the argument was people were better off under previous conditions, I would argue that it's true about the Habsburgs, but it's not true about the rest of the world. Because you can see by the rapid growth that's happened everywhere that we've allowed this through trade, it does benefit. It has benefited everybody, and it benefits the people who are worse off the most. So the first thing I would counter is that the U.S. is trying to build a federal system and it is trying desperately to shepherd people into autonomy and self-responsibility in order to prevent world wars. And the second point is that the evidence is that this has been the most successful project in human history. The correct criticism of it is that it has been sold ideologically as an opposition to communism, and this ideological sale, this via positiva sale, is what's wrong. And because we're selling democracy and we're selling consumerism, which is the counter to communism, but we're also letting all liberal hedonism and immorality ride on top of it, unconstrained, to the point where, we're trying to promote LGBT and homosexuality, whatever, which are properties that have contributed to the destruction of the family in the West and our declining populations to the rest of the world, and they don't want anything to do with it. They don't want anything to do with our liberal morality, which is really unregulated, undisciplined human consumption and discipline. And the reason's worse for them is because they're trying to get their people into defense of the commons, and we're already there. So I would say that I disagree with all the points there, all the major points, but I agree that the spread, the use of this mission by the progressives has been catastrophic. Moritz, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, you often use terms, of course, as shorthand, like, for example, the US's strategy. But I think in this case, it pays to identify who that is, the US. It's not the US as the US, it's the elite that used to construct the framework of the society, and then the pitch, let's say, to the other civilizations, which are no longer in power the way they used to be.
Correct. That's brilliant. Thank you. And this is where I should say that Martin's right. Is that the strategy that was put in place in 1944, 1945, the Bretton Woods method and everything that fell out of it was that we couldn't fight the communists alone, and the world was in too bad a shape after the world wars. And so that what we did is we subsidized everybody with access to the only remaining market, America, for free at American workers' expense, in order to allow the world to rebuild and hopefully to entice those cultures that were going through transition into the rule of law model rather than the rule of man model, because our view was that the communism was just another form of dictatorship, and that which has turned out to be real true, and it was going to be detrimental to mankind and basically form the new basis of empires, just like Islam formed a base of new empires, and just as Islam has adopted, and since the 70s, the same strategy as the Marxists. So you're right. What happened is, in the especially during the Vietnam War, the Jewish left displaced the Anglo classical liberals as the elites, and they did this by design, by capturing the institutions, and because the institutions at that time were forced to try to maintain scientific and technological advantage over the Soviets and the communists in general. And so they moved from loyalty in the higher academy to credentialism only in the academy. And so this let people into the academy who had seditious ambitions, and those people then moved into the various organs of government and proceeded with their so-called march to the institutions of cultural production. So the moral ambition we had has been captured by an immoral culture. Is that Moritz, does that satisfy the question?
Yes, and I just add for further disambiguation, I think the comment that when you say we, that is primarily a strategy set out by the elite, which is a fairly small minority of a population, and then sold to the population that, to a large extent back then, still had the capacity to actually evaluate that and make reasoned consent or have reasoned support for it, rather than only be sold to.
And they had higher trust. I mean, part of the left's
Yes.
ambition is to undermine trust, right? I mean,
Right.
that's what they do. They cause dissent. So you're right. So even if they were an elite, the public had reasonable amount of trust in them.
Yep.
And so
and they had the mechanisms available to validate that trust. The trust was not merely a holdover from, let's say, a blindness or some kind of other previous successful form of trust, well, of creating that, but it was the consequence of a fairly widely existing self-determination and therefore cooperation as a consequence of everybody being able to self-determine.
Mhm. Brandon, you're on mute.
We've proven that we can't hold it. We can't purport to export it any longer.
Yeah, I love you, Brandon, because you first, you're so parsimonious and you cut to the end, and then I've got to figure out how the hell you got there. So I want to help I can figure that out, but could you explain that for the audience?
Sure. We're attempting to export rule of law and, as we describe it, democracy, participatory government between the peoples involved in governing. We've pushed that franchise down to everybody here, essentially. Just too many. And then we've exported their intuitions to the rest of the world, which are not congruent or concordant with their peoples. I mean, they disrupt other places worse and faster than it disrupts us here.
Yeah, so
I
that's
certainly see
the argument.
democracy as a hostile imposition. Take it away, please.
So the argument I usually make is it's the India versus China argument. You need to have a military, or the Prussians are the ones who invented this, but you need to have a military that is loyal to the state first. And from there you can build rule of law. From there you can build rule of law into a market economy. But we did it over 600 years at minimum, and it's probably over 1800 closer. So we did it over a very long period of time, and so the rest of the world has had to do it in a short period of time. So while we could do it, we could dispose of generations, so to speak, the ignorance of generations, other civilizations can't. So when you take them immediately to democracy, unless they've got most of the package, it's very hard for them. So of course you could get literacy in China if you have the Red Army, if you have a history of empire. And of course they had a hell of a time doing it in India. So, of course Prussia could do it. Our systems are all basically Prussian because that's what happened, right? We brought them all back here once we understood what efficient government looked like. So what I think Brandon's trying to say is that you just can't take these things willy-nilly to people and start with democracy and hope it's all going to work out. You have to actually evolve a population to the point where they have the rational incentives to be able to engage in participatory democracy without regressing to what their natural intuition is, which is to favor self and family and maybe clan over the interests of the commons. It's actually really hard to develop the commons comes first. I mean, we got a German here. I mean, they're freaking the masters of it, right? One of the things I notice you notice in negotiating around the world, and of course there's tons of people who teach this stuff, is that like the just small differences in how open and trustworthy you are. Like you can count on Germans to be open and direct the whole time. You can count on Russians to be direct but not open. You can count on Americans to be over, what do you call it? Overly communicative in an effort to build trust, right? You could count on the French to try to scam you in whatever way possible, right? I mean, there's and to bully you, and so, and you can negotiate with the Arabs, and you realize that it doesn't make any difference because whatever they agree to today, they're going to change tomorrow, right? And so you run into these cultures, and we all have different commitments to the commons, and so it's very hard to produce commitment to the common. And the only way we've discovered how to do it is the way we do, which is militia, military, state, rule of law, and then you build an economy. And if we try to make people bypass that process, they're starting out with the wrong raw material in the population. Is it working somewhere? Well, it's working where the IQ is there. And it's not working where the IQ isn't there. So it's really IQ is just adaptability. Go ahead, Francis.
So Curt, then now I have a question. For civilizations like China, where state is a founding institution, is it even possible to unwind the clock, so to speak, and truly build a rule of law society? Because Europeans, you started evolving from small bands and so on, and you gradually built the institutions through law first.
Yes.
Whereas China started with state first. And
Yes.
there's, I think back in the days, this is probably around the first decade after the founding of the PLA, there was a famous conversation between then Premier and Zhou Enlai and another guy. And so it goes, one of them was asking the other whether it's possible to build a rule of law society. And then Chairman Mao jumped in and basically said, I think we still need to go with rule of men, basically state.
Right. Well, the rule of law is beautiful in that if everybody, it's a policing cost, right? So the reason you want rule of law is the same reason you want to get rid of slavery. It's just incredibly much cheaper. The evidence of the Chinese people, though, is entrepreneurial, right? I mean, the Chinese diaspora is incredibly successful. So there's no reason we can see from the outside why the incentive isn't there. The problem is the country's too big. It's sort of like the American problem today, right? Because the country's too big. And so when you try to organize it like that, in other words, it's a great market in the sense that it's big and has enough of a common language, right, and protocols, but it's pretty hard to actually take initiative. We saw what the entrepreneurs did there before the state clamped down on them. And yeah, there was a lot of bullshit going on there, right? I mean, talk about financial nonsense. I mean, it was the whole idea of becoming a bank and then letting the government carry all the risky debt while you took all the profits. I mean, that was kind of unfair. But I mean, if you look at the Chinese, there's no evidence the Chinese can't do it. Matter of fact, the evidence is quite the contrary. It's unfortunate that the kleptocracy at the top won't let them do it. Because it looked like it was going fine to me. I don't know. I'm asking for your feedback.
I think there's a fear in any central government that ruled over China that if they divest too much power from central government down to the state and provincial and the city level, then China would just disintegrate apart. And there's a certain truth in that throughout history, this has repeated, rings and repeat many, many times, mostly as if you believe George Friedman from Stratford, is because of the geopolitics of China. Right.
So again, I'm going to say, yeah, but why can't, you can have a via negativa central government, which is what the original US was sent to be. It's really what the German princedoms were sent to be, is that you can say, all right, well, these are the limits. Within these limits, it's none of our fucking business. But for everyone's good, we have to have these limits. And then let that entrepreneur, I mean, it was working, right? I mean, there was all this evidence it was working. So I don't know how to look at it any other way than there's evidence the Chinese people can do it. So if you say there's dissolution, well, the cycle of empire to federation is well known, right? You create an empire to create you create a standard of behavior, standard of weights and measures, but then at some point the empire becomes a rent seeker, and so you break into federations, and so it redistribute the government. It looks, I don't see why China can't do that, and I haven't anyone give me an answer. They blame it on this culture thing, except I'm like, you can blame it on this culture thing in your head, but I'd have to see evidence that it wasn't possible. But if you look at Chinese diaspora all the world, it's second only to Jews. So I can't see the argument. I'm waiting for a counter argument to see if you got one.
I haven't got one.
Yeah, I don't think there is one. I mean, you have a large population with a long history, sufficient homogeneity, right? You have a large body of people. It's got territorial sovereignty, right? You have huge waterways. You have, it's all the land is pretty much used, but you have everything going there. Trains can work there, unlike they can't work in the United States, or as well as even Germany. So you look at this geography, you look at the population, you look at the history, you look at the resources. If I don't see any evidence. I mean, really, what prevented China from being first is the government. I mean, the centralization of the government, bureaucracy, and the conversion of the bureaucracy from empirical to moral, right, is a legendary story of Chinese history. So why did China not become the West of the expansion? And it's because of the government. The people think a colonial period, this is a great bit of understanding, is that a lot of the colonial period happened because locals asked the British government to come save them from the fucking entrepreneurs and pirates. Mm-hmm. Right? Because the power, that was so easy to use the new technology for 100 guys to get together and go out and conquer some territory, that to over these people who had no advanced weaponry, that often the local populations asked the European governments to come govern them because it wasn't safe for them otherwise. And I can't remember where it is. The British government refused somebody like 7 or 8 times before they finally gave in. So I don't know. There's no reason. I mean, the real thing is the IQ's there. The IQ's there. The Confucian morality is there. And I don't see how it can't.
I think the IQ is there.
Even the history of it, even the history of the academic achievement, the history of study. I mean, all that stuff I still see it evidence coming out of the culture all the time.
I think the IQ is there for the core Han Chinese territories. You can't say the same for the Western buffer zones.
Right.
And that's the place that the central government has to placate.
I see.
Because otherwise, historically, that's been where the barbarians come in. So unlike the United States, which has a western border secured by ocean, the Chinese western border is secured by desert. It's hard to traverse, doesn't mean that it cannot be traversed.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I would say, great, that's a federal issue, and solve it with the federal government specifically allocated that issue. But the central government's ambitions to become a world power over the interests of the people is fucking insane.
Yeah.
Because I know all of us were, the Chinese are doing it, and all of a sudden this guy comes along and he throws a wrench in the works, and we're like, what the fuck?
He's got a chip on his shoulders.
I guess.
Okay, anyways, didn't want to...
Did we stray from a question?
Yeah, didn't want to
I was
diverse.
just going to say the same could be said about American government, trying to be a world power against interests of the American people.
Well, although take away the world power status, especially the dollar, and the American people get as poor as the Europeans. Right quick.
Yeah, that's happening right now.
Yeah, I know.
Super speed.
Well, I don't know. Let's see. I don't see anybody who can put together. The basic thing about a currency is for large amounts of money to work under it, you have to have predictable rule of law, and there's nobody that protects property like the UK and the US. There's just no alternative. So I don't see money flowing anywhere else.
I was also going to address the supposed export of democracy. It's not an export of democracy. I criticize democracy all the time, but we wouldn't be anywhere in as bad a situation as we are if will of the people actually mattered. Because we observe that whenever people vote wrong, their will is ignored. What's actually exported is anti-fascism.
Okay, so sorry, let me clarify. So what you're saying is the evidence is that the government does not give the people what it wants, it gives it what the elites want. That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Right. So I would say all that matters is rule of law, the democracy. Democracy is a perk if you succeed at rule of law. And that's it. And even then, it's as you said, it's becoming questionable whether democracy is actually very useful.
Or possible.
Yeah, I also argue that this was the goal from the beginning of the post-war order. Anti-fascism was immediately imposed on the Germans, and anti-fascism really means anti-order and anti-masculinity.
I can't test that one. The way the people at the time thought about it was classical liberalism, was the triangle. Well, it's really four sides. It's classical liberalism, French liberalism, socialism, German, Italian socialism, fascism, and communist authoritarianism. Right? I mean, that was your diamond to work
Do you
from.
mean a tetrahedron or actually a diamond?
I meant a diamond, but it's technically you can represent it on the triangle. I'm just trying to put 4 points together and not confuse the audience. All right. So there's basically 4 points, and everybody knew that's what they were doing. Everybody at the time knew there was a battle between the English model, the French model, the Germanic model, and the communist model, and everybody knew what was going on, and they knew it, and they were all afraid of it. I mean, the fascists were terribly afraid of the communists, and they were right to be. Like I said, Germany's always right. I won't say that out loud. They were right to be. The Continentals in general were right that the legal system for an island nation like the UK, with a long history of rule of law, and the people who invented it, along with the Dutch, right? That's obviously that's too far advanced for some of these cultures to go through quickly. The French are always authoritarian, and all they did is reproduce the nobility and the church as theological into the French philosophy of moral philosophy, but just secular Catholicism. And the Germans produced Kant to Hegel, and their attempt to do the same thing but with reason instead. And the Jews tried to create it their way, which is an underclass way, and that they were successful in propagating into Russia. So I mean, all cultures were acting in what we would consider a rational manner at the time. It's just that none of those rational matters were durable ideas. They were, in general, steps in a process, hopefully, of getting to what we would call classical liberalism or rule of law. There's no better term that we have yet today. So, I mean, theoretically, what you would want is everybody to be under classical liberalism which is really very close to what we would call social democracy today.
They're not fit.
Correct. Say that again.
We're not fit. They're not fit. We can't hold it now. You need the law first, and we don't have that. And they don't have it anywhere.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the way it was conceived of was completely contrary to human nature.
It was optimistic. All of the Enlightenment philosophies were optimistic.
That's a euphemistic way to say it.
Well, I mean, I love this difference between you and I, because I try to look at the positive side and you try to look at the underbelly. But if I look into the minds of those people, that's what they thought. I mean, you can see it in what they said, how they approached the world, what they thought they were doing, what they wrote about.
We'll give them their optimism then, right? If they lose it now.
Correct. Right. I mean, it's okay to experiment, right? You have to experiment, right? They took an experiment, and unfortunately, and we have a better chance of it than others were, is that it failed pretty fast, right? It failed pretty hard and pretty fast. So, and the reason is precisely that optimism. It's just you can too much optimism, and when you take away the constraints, I mean, this is one of the things. So let's not pick on Chairman Z. How do you say it right? Z. She, right? As for a moment, he says, I don't like Western consumerism because I think it makes the people lazy.
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong. And I would say it's worse. It makes their minds lazy. And so it's not like we've got the right answer. It's like, right, Brandon, we fucked up. We've run the experiment and it failed. Well, more interestingly, every one of those experiments failed.
Experiments can fail. Operations don't.
Yeah, exactly. So if I look at it, those experiments failed, and I could be like Martin and assume the worst of everybody. Martin, I'm just fucking with you, or I could say, well, these people, all of them thought, because you could see it in what they said, they thought they were doing the right thing, and there's a little truth to every civilization doing what feels right to it. The problem is everybody was wrong, because all that really matters is rule of law. That's all that matters. Other than that, the type of government's almost arbitrary. I'm waiting for Brandon to say something.
So quick time check. We've spent 40 minutes on this question.
Well, it's a great question. I don't feel like I've done it justice. I mean, and that's because we're not including the starting method, right? In other words, the starting condition, which was, holy shit, empires create world wars. Let's stop this world war thing, which was brilliant, right? Then, and we're in a position to do it. The next thing was that because of the Industrial Revolution, everybody's stupidly optimistic about human nature, as if we're all special and virtuous snowflakes, right? And then we introduced women, and then the Jewish left moved to the America and switched from class Marxism to race Marxism in the one country with the least ability to defend itself against ideas. So if you look at those pieces, there's a lot of axes of causality coming together to create the current, oh my God, what a freaking disaster. Don't let women run education ever again. I thought I'd get a laugh out of that one. I got nothing. I got nothing. Don't let women run.
It's just obviously true.
It's just too obviously true. I think that that we've covered the question, but we have to keep it in context of, the Industrial Revolution was like, it created a lot of opportunity for being right and wrong. And, we did some good right things, but we did wrong ones. And our experiment that took an optimistic view of human nature failed. Okay. What's next?
It's a related question. Curt frequently discusses the idea that left-leaning ideologies began to influence US institutions heavily starting in the late 60s and 70s following the rise of postmodernism. How does this view align with the policies of forced integration in the 50s, the Nazification efforts starting in the 40s, the US stance during the Suez Crisis in 56, and its support for groups opposing French colonial rule in Algeria and Vietnam? Considering these actions, could one argue that the US was a leftist anti-European empire as early as Roosevelt's time, with only minor shifts during the Truman and Eisenhower years due to tensions with the Soviet Union? My answer is I would certainly argue this. World War II was a total war by communists in a more general sense than economic, from both sides against the last truly right-wing resistance, right-wing subsequently being outlawed in the American and Soviet empires and other domains.
Certainly read this. Total war by the communists from both sides against the last truly right.
I see the American institutions were already at that point being taken over, and it's the reason why US was in the war in the first place.
Distinction with a difference. The Christian progressives, right, were activist government, right? That's absolutely true. And they did not have an optimistic view of mankind, though, because they're the people that push the eugenics movement, right? So it was the progressives, the eugenics movement, the change of classical liberal society from reactive to active government. And the reason is that the Soviets were making so much progress that the world took notice. And that notice took root in the United States. It took root everywhere. Because the Soviets were trying with huge human cost to modernize really the most backward place among the European peoples, with one of the most difficult territories to do it in. But they had the power to do so, and they had an absence of opposing institutions, but mostly what they had was an extraordinarily large population concern compared to the rest of us. And so they were comfortable losing millions of them in the process. So in that context, we have, how does he say it here? So in that context, you're right in that there was a progressive movement ahead, but that progressive movement is the same movement that was preserving our borders and maintaining cultural and ethnic homogeneity. So so if you say, well, it happened beforehand, I would say yes, because Marxism happened beforehand. That whole myth that started building up. The Soviets had come into place. Our position was Christian progressive which was an upper class thing, rather than a New England thing, rather than a Jewish underclass thing like Marxism. But so at any event, I'm trying to avoid going into more detail. So in the context, people were acting rationally based on their knowledge and incentives at the time. And yes, as I say, this Christian optimism is a freaking curse, as much as a benefit. What happens though is after the war, we have during the war, we have to justify the attack on the Nazis. And after the war, we have to deal with the Marshall Plan and the whole Holocaust narrative and the migration of the Marxists from Europe and fomenting class warfare to the States, fomenting sex and race warfare. So there's a lot going on at this point. And I think there's a tendency of people today, like the person asking this question, to look back at the world and think that there's like some consensus mind about this stuff, instead of all these vectors of causality causing continuous conflict and competition and argument over what this future might be, now that the world has been somewhat freed of the crisis of starvation and it's more subject to the opportunities created by plenty. So I don't know. I mean, I say in here, I just disagree that you have my position. I mean, in other words, I argue that that's not my position, what the person says. And I would say that you can't expect people to have our hindsight. You have to look at them and the problems of their day and expect them to do the best they can with what they could do. And then from the result of those experiments, you figure out what works. The biggest problem we have is our fucking optimism allowed this Christian morality is too forgiving. And we let this stuff happen. And McCarthy was more than right. Does that make sense? Am I making sense here or not?
Yeah, I just don't see how Christian optimism drove America into a war that majority of Americans disagreed with.
That's a different question. You said it could, the other question was, the Americans had until around 1900, the opinion that the Europeans were the people who made wars everywhere, just like the current Muslims have the opinions that the Americans make wars everywhere. And so our view was that we needed to stop this Europeans making wars everywhere, similar to the Anglo mistake of saying, let's maintain the balance of powers and not let Russia take over Constantinople. I mean, it's the same mistake over and over again, which is trying to maintain the status quo without understanding what change in the status quo would provide. So, I mean, I guess I'm more forgiving of people in the past because I don't expect them to be able to see the future. I feel like I'm not making anybody happy and I'm talking too much. Okay, the next one is, could NLI increase decorum on digital channels? I don't know what the hell that means, but Maurice got suspended again.
Maurice just
Maurice, sorry, say Martin got
Martin
suspended
did.
again.
Yeah.
Suspended again. Maurice never gets suspended. Martin gets suspended again.
I mean, I would have to know more specifically what this individual is referring to.
He's talking about, I think he's talking about on
Well, on Telegram, I assume, but I mean,
I don't know. I found Telegram famous.
I can see that we could have some title limits, but I want to let people express themselves.
Right. I don't care if it makes it on Telegram. I don't want it to make it into Signal or Twitter. What I worry about is somebody saying something and getting a run and then screen captures of Telegram channel conversations and then presenting it as if it's the Institute policy. And
Specifically have in the description that views expressed by individuals do not represent those of the institute.
Yes, exactly. And I think that we have the argument which says that, look, the purpose of private conversations to let people vent. we tolerate people venting because it makes them feel better, and after they feel better, they can have just decent conversations. But if we shut them off, then we don't have the opportunity to have decent conversations with them.
And if it's about like limiting controversial opinions, that's impossible.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, I don't think it's controversial. I don't think I don't.
It's controversial to the mainstream.
Okay. Question number 4. What's the role of art in developing common group values? Can we ask a question I don't have to freaking answer? What is the role of art in developing common group values? How can we develop our mental faculties? Can we put this one off to later, guys? I don't want to talk for half an hour on another topic.
Okay. But obviously, you're the only one who studied art, so.
Right, but I feel like I've been talking too much already, and I want the rest of the team to participate.
Well, in that sense, the next question is also you.
Oh yeah, it's an easy question. How do you explain quantum entanglement? Well, it's so easy. It's determined at the point at which you make the split. And so if you know this, now you know this. Because when you make the split, because you got to think about the universe, everything's made by rotation of some sort. I can't do it the two opposite directions for some reason. I'm not able to make my body do this. I don't know. I can't make my fingers rotate in opposite directions. But basically, think of the world, the universe as making whirlpools, right? And so what's the matter, Martin? What's that smile for?
I was just trying it.
Okay. So what happens is when you split something, you're going to get the same effect, which is differences in spin. We call it spin. It might be way more complicated than that. The actual math looks out for these kind of objects. The name of the shape I forget, which is extraordinarily complicated. But in general, it averages out as this kind of spin we can measure. So when you separate them, it's deterministic. So if you know this one, you know that one. And so what we do today is we split these two things out. And if they're if they're the same, we know somebody interfered with the message. So that's how this encryption technique works. Is that we know it's false if somebody interfered with it, because if you touch it, therefore the spin will change. So there's entanglement is trying to communicate the idea that information transmits across spooky distances. As far as I know, as far as I can test, anyone says this, there's no information transmission.
So in other words, you can use it as a sophisticated encryption algorithm, but you cannot use it as an instantaneous, like, subspace communication mechanism.
Right. Now, so there is one issue, because no, that's way too complicated. Essentially, the universe appears to be made out of everything seems to be discrete, and mathematics describes continuousness. And so, in other words, it measures it tends to measure the behavioral result, like statistically, instead of what's actually happening operationally. But the universe appears to be discrete, and there's at least one level below the one we're talking about now, which is the quantum background, that we can't see into yet to see what's happening. But as far as we can tell, there's no way to transmit information through the quantum background other than what we're aware of today. There just doesn't appear to be any way. And there's no bandwidth left from the quantum background up to us there's no bandwidth available in there for anything else to be communicated. So in other words, there can't be any woo-woo. What there can be is pattern recognition, but that's about it. Francis, I'm waiting to see if you thought that was cogent enough for the audience.
I think that sufficiently answered this question.
Okay.
I'll read it from Cal. I've been wondering about the interaction between ethical racial groups, the reality of outliers, and of the race cases of
The rare cases.
exogamy, the rare case of exogamy that occur. In the case of which outliers are more appropriately adapted to the group strategy of other races, should said individuals be included in the group society? If so, how can one avoid parallel society due to mean regression? Would introgression be a solution? And if so, how do we avoid hybrid breakdown? Would a gene frequency percentage based on citizenship be a viable solution, with marriage being the condition for retained citizenship from a partner that is of a separate heritage?
And there are already answers from me and Gabriel, so I'll read mine. This presumes a universalist answer. We cannot somehow decide this for the whole world, and there are costs and benefits to either choice. The evidence, however, is that people all over the world that are not propagandized with lies and moralisms don't want people that are not like them in genetic, cultural, and ideological or religious respects around them. That other groups produce outliers isn't really a concern for them. Regression to the mean that is to the more common characteristics of the given ethnicity in next generation and revolt against integration of their parents is also worth noting. Gabriel, do you want to read yours?
Yeah, sure. Since it was like a should question, should they do that? My answer would be the decision should be made by the group in question, regardless of how any single person feels about it, since it's the group that would bear the cost, not the immigrant or any individual person from within the group. If they decided to do so, they will also decide the criteria for acceptance, including the nation of origin, IQ, and productive traits, the rate of immigration, the policies for assimilation, and population management. All of these things entail cost, and it's only a question of minimizing them in relation to whatever benefits the group thinks it'll get. Keep in mind that genetics constitute a form of common capital, which is why this decision ought to be made concurrently by the group, and the personal opinion does not factor into this. Basically.
Okay, I agree with both of those positions.
Oh, they're the same position.
I guess I don't really understand the question. I've been wondering about the interaction.
Cal is asking whether it's an universalist assumption that if there's an outlier from one race that thinks more like typical
Right.
one on the right, if he should be incorporated into that group instead.
So highly commercial societies tend to be open because they see their benefits in the market, and highly more productive or harmonious societies tend to be insular. So you have the problem of what's insuring me. If it's my family and my people, then I want to have it homogenous, because the costs of those costs that you and Gabriel talked about are really high to me. If I have a market economy and I perceive these people as just customers, the costs are very low to me. They're actually the opposite, is their opportunities to be. So you have a spectrum of people dependent upon their degree of sophistication and development to do this. The problem is there's like in anything, there's sort of this piece, there's good optimum equilibrium, because as I think my friend Rudyard put out a good video on this the other day. It's just that, you end up spending down your genetic, cultural, social, and normative institutional capital when you bring in too many people, and especially if they conflict. So I would say that it's it's like this. Think of it as we have a country and we externalize, we ship production overseas or to another country. And what that does is impoverishes our workers for the benefit of the people who are running the business, right? In other words, we're actually doing what's called labor arbitrage, and they're capturing the labor arbitrage's profit, but it's actually harming the local polity. When you say this isn't always true, because there's sometimes where there's so much comparative advantage that you want to move your labor from doing one thing to another, and you need to free the labor up. But that's only true if there's labor scarcity. So the same thing happens with immigration, is if you bring people in and they are essentially producing labor arbitrage, like what's happening with many of our immigrants at the lower end, is that they're actually making wages go down. Now, who's benefiting from wages go down? Well, I mean, the people who run the businesses are get benefiting from it, and the people who are buying the services from those businesses are getting it. But who's getting left behind by it? Well, we have vast portions of the United States that are being left behind by it. So is this productive, or is this parasitic? It's indirectly parasitic. So when you say, so if you add on to that, well, okay, now culture is harder. It's harder to come to political agreements. It's harder to maintain, like, one of the reasons we can't maintain the commons anymore is because they said, well, you can't punish Black people anymore because they have a different culture. But now we can't regulate behavior on the street like we used to. So this stuff gets worse and worse and worse. So I mean, when you get into these issues, you're starting to burn down all this other capital instead of accumulating and maintaining that capital, and it's working to everyone's disadvantage. And so what you get in the end is what we call bowling alone, or you get the dissolution of the social order. You got right now we're down to where we're dissolving the family too. So when you say these things, I'm like, well, there is a universalist answer, and that is, as long as there are no externalities, fine. But try to find a place there are no externalities. We have particular minorities in this country that are they're a net gain. We have minorities that are a net loss. Okay, fine. So which ones do we want to keep? It's like the more Asians, and to some degree, the more Hindus, the better they can integrate, right? I mean, Asians integrate just fine. What's Gabriel saying?
As long as they don't form their own conclaves.
Well, that's exactly right. As long as you integrate. I mean, the point is, are you integrating? Right, that's the most it. But then if you start, what happens is what we universally observe in people is when the population gets between 6% or so, as they start acting as a group on their interests. Mm-hmm. So it's better to say that there's a maximum rate of introgression that can happen, which creates full inclusion. Assimilation, which means that the people who come have completely adopted the method, the local methods. So I mean, even today, would you say that the Scots-Irish, the English, and the Germans have fully integrated in America? No. Would you say the Irish and the Italians have fully integrated? Well, not the Italians, maybe the Irish.
Maybe Brandon.
But time actually helps there.
He's
right?
only half. You're only like half Italian, aren't you?
65%.
All right, yeah. Well, we got the good part of the Italian. What are you saying, Francis?
I was going to say time helps. So if you imagine this analogy,
it's right? rate. It's the rate of integration, right? So that's actually the problem.
Yeah, that's the issue that I mentioned, that parents who know why they can integrate, and then their kids reject it and revolt against
I think their kids reject the identity part of it. Well, I'll see how my kids grow up, but I've seen plenty of second generation Chinese that on the outside they still look different, even though America is the only place they've ever known. And so they reject the integration to go find their own identity, just like what am I kind of deal. But eventually, if you ask them, are you Chinese, are you American? Most of them will answer they're American.
I always say this to Francis offline, it's like, I can't tell the difference between his thinking and mine. Right, I can't tell the difference. You probably can, but I can't. So it depends on whether you've bought into it or not. I think religion has a way more to do with it than we assume. I think religion is one of the founding issues.
Well, it's the group strategy.
Yeah. So do we cover that issue?
I guess so.
Wait, so since you talk about religion, then is it easier for a group without religion, without strong religion, to fit in and to adapt than it is for a group with strong religion?
Well, we
Yeah.
have to add that we're not talking exclusively about theistic religions.
Yeah, every group has a narrative and a strategy. Whether they call it a religion or not, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The
So
civilization founding myth.
right, it's based on the mythos. So religion is just a means of, a myth explains the group strategy. Our religion is a way of indoctrinating and reinforcing it and performing the bond. So
Well, the problem of the West is that our religion right now is Holocaustianity.
is what?
Holocaustianity.
Ugh.
I'm a bit afraid. You know, I used to say I don't want people to see inside my head because I don't want them to know what goes on in there. It's too terrifying. You know, but then I'm like, Martin, I mean, you take the cake. Anyway,
Okay. Question 7. Should non-whites be encouraged to have white kids with screened white donor eggs and white sperm? So would this be feasible for parliamentarians like Francis, Saif al-Basir, and I don't know who this person is, non-white parliamentarians in the West who acknowledges the ethocentric long-term view in general? What is your view on this?
Ethnocentric. We have 3 answers to this already. Oh, mine was once again can't give a universal answer. I obviously have my views on this, the ones stated in the previous answer, outbreeding, depression, and all that. On the other hand, it's hard to argue for depriving those that demonstrate investment into changing the situation in the right direction of this choice. And it's certainly not my preference to go beyond Nuremberg laws and start breaking up existing marriages and families. We're beyond any chance of achieving total purity, though in general, the rate of intermixing is nowhere near as bad as some doomers think. Francis, next one is yours.
Yeah, I said my answer is pretty straightforward. Well, so I'm already married. I have daughters, and I just want them to find husbands with equal higher IQ in comparable social economic class and have lots of kids. So I prefer them to find European husbands, since I do believe the Europeans possess an optimal level of neoteny. Although this is probably covered by my recent readings of Richard Lin, I'm more concerned about dysgenics, right? The
yes,
less births from
yes.
groups with higher IQs than I am about what race they're from.
Yes, correct. I have the same
The
opinion.
race is really just for me is more of a it's a heuristic based selection criteria. If I know the average IQ from each racial group, then without knowing this person further, I can make a rough guess of what their IQ and socioeconomic class is. Although, I've worked with some very talented, very smart people of African descent. There's, I think he's probably now a technical fellow dude at Microsoft. And he's black, and he's way smarter than I am.
Mhm.
Yeah, but at that point, you really have to worry about outbreeding depression, because that's like the most distant population.
I'm sorry, what it is?
he's saying that the difference in Asians and Europeans were both highly neotenous.
Oh, I see.
It's
I just mean that we're far more related than we are to Africans.
yes. And so the problem is, so this is one of the things that is dirty, the dirty subject is that you would really like to maintain breeding pools on the size of 1,500 or 3,000 people. All right, because that's where you get the maximum error correction. But when you start mixing gene pools, that's where you don't get error correction. And so, and if you look at this, it's not only in the mutation, it's basically the reproductive issue. So you see really weird, this is just beginning to come out, right? So we have to be careful. You start seeing very strange effects happen in hybridized populations.
Mm.
Overall, you go to the median of the IQ, right? Which is why, again, what's the difference between Europeans and East Asians? It's a couple of points, right? Right, but what's the difference between Europeans and South Eurasians? Well, it's a fucking
15,
standard,
roughly.
right? What's the difference between South Eurasians and Africans? It's a fucking standard deviation. I mean,
It's the same as between wolves and coyotes.
yeah, I mean, it's a huge difference. So I mean, so that's just one difference. And of course, we are constructed roughly of the past 6 generations, right? That's what determines most about us is the past 6 to 8 generations. After that, it starts getting nullified by all the competition. So when you look at this, I would say, well, the most important thing is I'm going to go with France. I have the same opinion, which is, are you in a gene pool that has the proper attributes to maintain this high trust, highly innovative social order, society, or not? And if you're not, then that's not good. Unfortunately, that's what we've been doing. We've been importing those people.
So, Curt, before we move on, I have a question there. So when you said we start seeing weird issue in hybridized population, is it? I remember you mentioned this before, and I thought about it, and I thought I understood the issue there. Is it because whereas hybridized population used to be very rare, with globalization it's becoming more common, and so let's say that a rare disease due to hybridization is 1 in a million. When you only have thousands of unions, it may not show up. But now, then, if you have, say, 10 million of such, it's a statistic.
Let's not take disease, because the one I notice is upstairs. And so what's happening is we have enough data now to begin to see these things.
Mhm.
And we don't have enough certainty over what each segment of the DNA is doing in practice to be able to understand how what evocations and collisions are happening.
Right.
But what we do see is we see certain mental instabilities occurring and mental differences happening, and they don't appear to be very good. And then it's also hard to correct the phenotype. And how can I say this without being unkind? But there are parts of the world where there's so much genetic collision that nobody's very good looking. We won't mention any, although I have been to many of them, and it's kind of surprising, right? So what you want is actually, you can't, it's very, natural selection starts having a problem. So I'm like I said, I follow this stuff every day, right? So I'm watching what's happening and I'm seeing the differences, and you can see the pattern emerging, but it's not at the point where anybody feels comfortable talking about it too openly, even though it's starting to become relatively, it's like everything else, right? We couldn't talk about IQ, we did, then we couldn't talk about sex differences, and then that was solved. We couldn't talk about class differences, and then that was solved. We couldn't talk about race differences, and that was solved. And there's just a lag between this data being discovered and people's tolerance for it as it works out. And I think it's like everything else. The profs have to die off, right? You have to, the science progresses with tombstones. So
I
Okay,
just
so-
just in my lifetime, I've been surprised. I mean, what's changed.
Gabriel,
I
you
want-
want to talk? Oh,
I-
sorry, Martin. Go ahead.
I wanted to add my explanation of outbreeding depression because I don't think it was sufficiently clear. It's just if the two populations have evolved separately for thousands or tens of thousands of years, basically the genes interact only together and the errors their combinations produce get selected out. Whereas when you start to hybridize, those combinations are entirely new and may have various negative effects that up to this point haven't been selected against. So yes, we see in the data that there are various mental disorders, and there's also the issue that hybrids find it practically impossible to find organ donors when something happens.
So, the net result is, so I'm trying to, now the opposition is gonna say, well, why do you guys care? I'm like, well, because some of us care about the consequences. The question is, why don't you care, right? Why don't you care about the consequences? I'm not hurting anybody. In fact, you are. You know?
You're hurting the genetic capital of the population.
Or as one of the person, one of the people in Telegram chat says, "Do not piss in the gene pool."
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah.
And which is,
You're not hurting anybody, you're hurting everybody. That's a good-
I've sort of experimented widely, if that's the right thing, and stereotypes tend to be pretty true, but it's just easier. It's easier when your groups are developmentally closer than if they're far apart.
Gabriel, do you want to read your answer? I guess it's pretty similar.
Yeah, it is. I'll read it anyway. Again, this is a question of whether or not we want to bear the cost as a group. As I see it, the bottom line is that non-whites benefit while the white host tries to minimize the cost. All while the white fertility rate is already catastrophic. My preference would be to steward other races' ascent into sufficient prosperity so that they don't feel the push to leave their nations, consume our capital, and leave their own behind. Basically, that's it.
Correct. So how would the audience, what do we tell the audience about what we're saying here? Because these questions are similar, is that we do what's called full accounting, right? So when you say, when we ask for a question, we don't say, oh, we like this, or I would prefer this. We try to find the limit, right? The very end point, whatever is determining the outcome, and that produces decidability. So what we're saying is, we're fully accounting for inputs and outputs or consequences. And so when we look at these things, that's what we're doing. We're saying, well, I mean, in the end, data is data, fact is fact. These things are difficult. What's the next one?
What ideas does the Institute have about the education system, how the education system should function? Gabriel links to the article of the Constitution under that.
Right. I think you can just go read that. The major differences are that we say train the whole person, which means body, physical fitness, intuition, which you would think of as mindfulness. It's what religions usually teach. We're trying to teach mindfulness so that you are not manipulable and you are self-regulating. And so that helps you produce mental stability and happiness. And then we want you to develop the way we position it is the grammars, which is the grammars are just a spectrum of skills that teach you to how to compute against all levels. This is basically saying the disciplines, but we can separate, what we do is we turn all the disciplines into some sort of what we would call operational logic. So they're all consistent. And it's the same across all of them. And then we say the last thing is your occupational trajectory. It's much more like the German system, and that it would try to get you into the workforce as early as possible. And we try to get you out of babysitting and indoctrination as quickly as possible. So there are a few skills we change. We add economics, we add basic understanding of money, and we add a basic understanding of contracts, and we had a basic understanding of contract law, basically, and a basic understanding of how to manage projects and how to manage your household income. We try to give you the necessary life skills for modernity, and which includes those. What did I miss there? Oh, and then we also restore manners, ethics, and morals. Right, natural law, manners, ethics, and morals. So the net result is what we're trying to do is that's education proper. Now the problem is that it doesn't look like you need more than a couple hours of education a day to achieve all that. And so we are trying to figure out how to do that with cutting the total hours down, because it doesn't seem to make it doesn't seem to do anything except make kids tired and frustrated to be in school longer. It doesn't mean that they don't need to do things like exercise and whatever, but classroom is limited. The next thing we're doing is we've tried to gamify as much as possible, and I've done a lot of work on this, which is that rather than just listen to a verbal teacher's instructions, a lot of this stuff can be learned by playing games, and not stupid games, but interesting games. And so hopefully we would make that happen. I'm trying to think of what's going through Martin's head right now with his grin on his face. What kind of games is going to make?
Just a reminder, I was saying, play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Yes. And then, of course, as you get into high school, we'd like to run education as simulations. We've tried that here in the States. It's working great. So you play a police department, or you play a fire department, or you play a bank or whatever, and the software facilitates you all playing these different roles, and you begin to see. So it's getting out of the all we got is books and we only got is writing, and now we're going to talk and we're going to read books and we're going to write. We're trying to get out of that and modernize education quite a bit, reduce the time in education, and get you into the workforce earlier. And part of this reason is we want to eliminate the need for unnecessary college and remove the incentives for unnecessary college. So you're in the workforce, you have spending money, you can afford to find mates and have a social life. You become pro-social and socialized, and then you're able to have a family in your 20s. So that's it. In the college, I won't go into it because it's too detailed, but basically it gets rid of the rent-seeking aspects of the university and the usury of the university, because they have really become a cancer in many ways. And also, what else is? Oh, and so it requires, just like much of our work, it requires truthful reciprocal speech. So people can't get up there in academies and promote hostility to the civilization. That's mostly it. I don't want to cover it in more detail because it's all written up there.
All right. Question 9 from Dars Luzak. Is the Washington regime turning the U.S. into an empire? At least some Americans are complaining their freedoms are taken away. Is the U.S. become an enemy it has fought for too long?
My answer is turning. No, Lincoln turned the US into an empire. Wilson and Roosevelt made it global. Anyone only now seeing fundamental freedoms being taken away is very late to this and only seeing the worst transgressions. by far the worst introgression was the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, and much of what followed is its consequences. Fundamentally changing the main reason for making money is to be able to afford escaping those consequences.
Yeah, I got nothing to add to that. That's pretty much right. I think, oh boy, Martin, you guys handled the next one. Question 10. Can I read it? From
Yes.
Tyler. Could you explain how the falsification testimonialism logic we do at the Institute differs from the formal logic you would find elsewhere in the academy?
Logic itself makes no claims to the outside world that would require a measurement. As such, internal consistency is the only test of truth for logical statements. While this is not incompatible with testimonialism, testimonialism is also applicable to science and all its disciplines, where external correspondence, which is empirical test, and potentially various discipline-specific criteria for testimony become relevant. Curt, there's your answer, Andrea.
I think Gabriel's get it, but I think you're not. I don't think you put in reciprocity there.
Well, I like to make a distinction that reciprocity is when you're not making just a claim, but a proposition.
Yeah, I have it here. Proposition of an exchange.
Okay, great. So Gabriel,
They test only for two dimensions of communication, one being identity, meaning non-conflation, the second being internal consistency, meaning non-contradiction. On top of that, we test for empiricism, which means external correspondence, operationalism, existential possibility, 5, full accounting, meaning scope consistency, testing all dimensions we can. 6, limits, under what terms and circumstances does it cease to apply? And 7, if it's a proposition of an exchange, we test for reciprocity.
that's really good. I don't know if I think an exchange is not right. Because a lot of the time they're talking about a good, which implies a taking, not an exchange.
Well, it's an exchange in general sense where another person is involved, whether
Great.
with you or not.
Not worth arguing about that one. Too good, not too good as it is. So what is this? So
We provide actionable answers and other people don't.
the cut to the
Yeah.
chase. Look, for the audience, there are only so many dimensions humans can testify to. They are realism, realism or naturalism, right? It can happen, which is metaphysics. Identity, which is right, internal consistency, existential possibility, external correspondence, reciprocity, a full accounting within stated limits, and I've already stated reciprocity. So this is all you can testify to, right? You can't possibly testify to anything else. Those are the tests of consistency across the spectrum of human faculties and competencies. So if you can, so that's what we test for. And so our test of truth is this basic checklist. So how does it differ from the formal logic you find? In the academy, a formal logic tends to mean symbolic logic, where they have generalized propositions in an effort to make logic look like mathematics. We use operational logic. In other words, excuse me. So what they're really doing is the logic of sets most of the time. And so you have mathematical logic, which is the logic of ratios. You have this symbolic logic, was the logic of sets. And we do operational logic, which is the logic of operations, or you consider actions. And so how we differ is that we write that. Now, in math, you have a very small vocabulary of just, a few glyphs, right? And in logic, you have more symbols, more glyphs, and more possible references. And in operations, you have the most glyphs and operations. Who's heading out? Who's heading out?
Run.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we differ from the academy the same way that mathematics, physics, and chemistry and biology differ from each other, and that mathematics, formal or set logic, and operational logic have different, have a larger scope of reference. We think of it as dimensions. So there's fewer dimensions in math, more dimensions in logic, and more dimensions in operations. And essentially, there's no closure in any system, which is the whole thing people talk about with Doolittle all the time. But that operationally, we obtain closure because those 8 questions we asked, those 7 or 8 questions we asked, is that means that we falsified against all of reality. And so reality is providing closure instead of any symbol set we use. So externality is providing closure. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the correct answer for election.
Curt, by closure, do you mean decidability?
Yeah, so like there's this argument that some things in mathematics and logic are undecidable, right?
Right.
But the reality provides decidability if you have
Correct.
enough information.
I mean, we test against reality when we're making claims about reality. Testimonialism still applies to math, but obviously limited to internal consistency.
Right.
Yep.
This is the discourse. This is the stuff. Everybody's asking all these questions about race and about color. All right. The stuff I love is this nerdy shit about logic, right? So I talk about this all day, but what we've done is the part of what we've done here is the technical part of what we've done here is pretty amazing or pretty cool in historical terms. So from Evan.
Actually, from Peter. Number 11. Can you explain what happened to the state of Connecticut? How did it go from so Republican to being so Democrat? Which groups are responsible? Lastly, which state would you suggest young men from Connecticut to move to?
Any other fucking one.
Nobody prepared answer for that, since we're not Americans.
And it hurts me because my family founded this state. What happened is really quite simple. The progressives start here, so you start out with curse 1. And the second, because you got Harvard and Yale, which are both, and we also have Trinity and Wesley and a bunch of others, right? So you start out with the fact that the progressive movement is a derivation of Puritanism. And so, especially Puritan women. And so we start out with this problem. Then we get the Soviet experiment, and that takes root in these same places. So you get the unification of Marxism and Soviet Leninism and progressivism. And eventually Leninism wins out. Hillary Clinton, for example, is a Yaley. What was her work in? It was in Lenin. So Hillary's a Leninist. And so what happened here in the state of Connecticut is it's highly influenced by those universities. And so that spread here, just like certain things spread around DC, or certain things spread around New York, or certain things spread around Boston or Chicago for that matter. So that idea spread. The second thing that happened is Connecticut, Massachusetts, and California were the 3 states specifically because of their academic institutions that most tried to imitate the Soviets. Right? Now there's a clerisy, and they wanted to imitate the Soviets. What happened in Connecticut is they built up the state employees so much that and they gave them such benefits that Connecticut can't get out of it. There's no bankruptcy clause, so they can't walk away from those benefits. So what happened in that process, Connecticut was also was also part of the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. And the costs of living here started to go up. And so the Connecticut government basically drove all the business out of the state, leaving it with a post-industrial workforce lacking industry. In other words, during the rural wars, like all the rural farmers from England came to Connecticut and Massachusetts, Framingham in particular in Massachusetts, Bristol and the I-95, I-90, no, I-84, whatever, 91 causeway. So what happened is we built this stuff up. So we have the equivalent going on here, the same thing that's happening in Detroit. It's just happening on a much larger scale because Detroit's one city with one industry, but Connecticut's wiped out our entire industry. Even our insurance companies, insurance is basically invented here, has been wiped out. So the only thing that's keeping Connecticut afloat is people in Fairfield County, which is basically the suburb of Manhattan, is that people fleed from Manhattan to Fairfield County for the tax benefits, and then the tax benefits generated by the people there are keeping the state afloat. Otherwise, the burden of state workers and their pensions, and the fact that the state is driven out, these workers bought into the Soviet thing, right? So you have a very left-wing labor market here. They actually just killed business. So basically, everybody the only people left in Connecticut are people who can't get out. So, and it's really the academic capture is more obvious here in New England than it is in a lot of places. It's pretty obvious in New York. It's pretty obvious in Boston, but it's most obvious here because it had the biggest detrimental effect here. And unlike Boston, when the tech community moved from Boston, people don't recognize this, but all the computer businesses used to be in Boston around MIT. But when the PC movement started, everybody moved to California, and that was partly due to HP and a few other factors. So everyone moved to California. So Massachusetts went through a crash. Their houses were like worth a third of their value, and so Massachusetts did some reforms. Connecticut didn't, because it didn't happen fast enough. It happened gradually. It's still going on. So that's what happened to Connecticut. Where do you go to? That's a good place to retire.
But he's talking about young men, so I'm guessing someplace with industry.
Say again?
It's probably someplace with industry, with enough of employment opportunities.
I would move to Florida or Texas. I would move back to Washington.
Washington is not that much better than Connecticut.
I know. I would move there for my reasons. I would say that the Carolinas are still a hot spot too. So I mean, that's where you're seeing people from here actually move. Carolinas, the Florida, Boston, or Texas. And it's sad because it's just sad. Anyway.
It has to crash before it gets better.
Well, it's the problem is there's no right for states to go bankrupt, and we need it. We need the right for states to go bankrupt. Because I mean, there's no unless they could do that, you're never fixing this place.
What do you do then when they go bankrupt? Do you just buy them?
When they go bankrupt, it means that they get to say you're only getting so much of your pension. You got to understand what a Connecticut pension is, right? A Connecticut state employee is basically a communist worker who doesn't have to do anything, can't get fired, right? Is immune from criticism, has lots of free time, and gets paid 3 times what a hardworking citizen gets paid. So that's what they created here. They created a Soviet system.
There, Curt, there was a term describing that in China, but of course, it doesn't even exist in China anymore. It's called the iron rice bowl. which means you can't
Iron
break it.
article.
Yes.
How old were you when you moved here?
What's that?
You were born here, or did you move here?
I was born over there, so I moved
Yeah.
here while I was 14. So I'm old enough to remember the stuff that my parents talk about. Not
Yeah.
yet old enough to be, I guess, indoctrinated
Get it
into
into
that
it, yeah.
system.
Yeah. All right. Have we out of time yet? Almost. We have time for one more?
Probably.
From Evan, is this the one?
Yes.
Yep.
How far away are we from a causal AI that can adjudicate using T-law? That's a great question. I know, if you asked me
Yeah,
6
that-
months ago, I would have given a different answer. What?
I have an answer from Moritz under there, so somebody will have to read it.
Your question, well, you gonna read it or I gonna read it?
Well,
I can
you
read it.
read better than
Moritz
doesn't matter.
says your question requires a bit of interactive disambiguation to make sure we understand what precisely you're asking. However, I, Curt, and others have explored the use, architecture, design, composition, and extension of the available set of tools over the last couple of months and believe that the tech is in a state where we can do meaningful things with it. The simplest thing you can do is just set up a powerful starting prompt, and thanks to custom instructions in ChatGPT, 2 sets of instructions that constrain and enable ChatGPT to support you in generalized reasoning. Depending on your own facilities with the method, it'll be easier or more difficult to get out of what you want. On the more complex end, we have possible paths for training an AI, and it took something like a combination of extensive training with good old-fashioned programming, and we are considering rewriting the Constitution in code rather than operational speech, but that would likely take away from completion of the Constitution as is. If you are interested in these topics, reach out to Martin. He will help you to get added to our AI chat.
Perfect. Yeah, so the basic difference is that the AIs are good at synthesis, but not analysis. And that it knows how to write my style, it knows how to write the legal style. It knows most of the work already. So I mean, ChatGPT does. But when I ask it questions, it always gets something wrong. Right? Because it needs to favor our definitions over other definitions. And so what we would need to do is 2 basic things to train them in the future. In other words, we can use it today, but in the future, in other words, I would think today it would form a much better search engine than any other search engine for asking questions. However, the point where we want to get it to is where it gets those largely right, because that's going to require we train it with a bunch of questions, a couple of 100 questions. And that's not that difficult, really. The second thing what's going to require is that its code interpreter, which is it's really their data manipulation AI. That thing is really good if you give it code, and almost everything we do can be expressed as object-oriented programming. So relatively easily. So we could take the Constitution's part of all this stuff and we could put it in that form, and it'd be very easy to have it understand that and perform logic, because it's really good at synthesis, but it's not good at logic. And what they're doing right now, if you look at where most of the work is going, it's going in to try to fix the logic problem. And fixing the logic problem is basically breaking things down into steps and then testing them. And so that requires more compute. And so we expect this direction to happen. So one of the things I look at is at the rate it's moving right now, it doesn't pay for us to invest in it, invest in doing this early work, when the rate of change is making it easier literally every week to do what we want. And in the end, it should be able to write law as code. It should be, because that's what you should be able to write law as code.
Yeah. At the very least, be able to parse the language to ensure it can only result in one parsing tree. It cannot be ambiguous. And then to be able to compile it such that it actually passes a compilation test.
Correct.
And of course, you can still write a bunch of garbage that doesn't do anything, because just because the program compiles doesn't mean it'll run. But at
Right.
least those two things you gotta be able to pass.
What's next?
Question for Martin and Curt. Why is Martin more compromising, intolerant than Curt?
If you were to psychologize, you could talk about me being lower class and not having well to remove myself from the consequences of the decline of our civilization. You could also say there's some consciousness of communism from the previous regime, so I was born just after its collapse. You could also say I'm Czech, that is a perfect mix of German and Slavic traits. But I'd ultimately like to think I'm just willing to take Curt's work along with other dissident right insights and take them to their actual final conclusions.
Yeah, I would say I mostly agree with Martin, but my job is to not, my job is to provide the counterpoint. Just as when I'm positive, Martin provides the counterpoint. We both know we're doing this, right? It's not an unconscious dance on our part, and it benefits the audience. Martin's right.
It benefits us too.
Right, it benefits. I tease Martin a lot for, he's like, Martin, you're gonna let me get away with this, or why didn't you let me get away with this? So Martin's always drilling down on the hard questions, but it's actually, I experience it as fun, don't you, Martin? Do you find it fun? I find it fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you ask me in private, well, Martin's right. But if you ask me in public, I've got to do my side of the job, right? Because Martin is more so. And the second thing is, it's not only class difference; it's a generation difference. You all have made me very conscious of my generation's optimism, and I still hold on to it dearly. Despite all the contrary evidence. So, I think those things are there. Part of my positioning is that I have Martin tends to work with Telegram, and I tend to work with Twitter more. So I have to be more judicious, and Martin is more injudicious.
Martin is more suspended.
What?
Martin is more suspended from Twitter.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's really it. So it's the only time Martin and I actually disagree on something, you'll find it's because we're disagreeing over the meaning of a word and which way to use it, so that we have the least confusion, right? And that's really what you find. It's like that. The rest of the time is like, yeah, you're right, Martin. Okay, or whatever. So,
I would like to point out that this is an expression of disagreeableness. That disagreeing is actually fun.
If disagreeing is actually fun, yes. I think that's it.
It's like you guys are doing code reviews.
What?
It's like you're doing code review, reviewing
exactly
each other's code.
like. Yep. Well, you should. It depends on what we're doing, right? So Martin and I working through lying in particular, which Martin understands very, very well. He's just pouring this stuff out, and and I want to be optimistic, and so I think the only thing that I notice is I go through and I have a certain way I like to present information incrementally, and so I do a lot of synthesis. But if you want to test whether something's got a hole in it or not, Martin will find it, which I suffer daily. All right, so we've been on for our 2 hours now.
Yeah.
All right, so we answered how many of our questions?
Doing really good. Well, 12.
13?
Because we skipped
12.
We skipped one.
12.
All right, so we can get a few more for next time. All right. Well, anybody have anything to add? Gabriel, did you have fun?
Oh, yeah.
Martin?
Yes,
Yeah, Francis?
I could disagree on a
Absolutely.
few things here, so I had fun.
All right, this is September 9th, Saturday, September 9th, Q&A office hours. If you want to see our, you want to add a question, it's, where is it? Where's the question?
So
It's in the description.
yeah, in the description of the doc, and I also when I after this meeting, when I populate the placeholder for the next one, it's in the description of the YouTube live stream as well.
Okay. All right, and so please submit questions if you have any. I'm trying to think of how I feel today. I'm kind of under the weather today, but I thought we did pretty good. We didn't have Luke to pick on or interject, or but we had, you know, also we didn't have,
Luke said that this is always going
Saturday
to be
morning is
that
always a
time
bad
for
time
him.
for him.
right, and then Noah is not here.
Noah's got
And-
clients.
Noah's got clients. So, or anyway, I had a great time. I felt like I talked too much though. All right, so we'll upload this and have fun. Bye-bye.
Yep.
See you in 2 weeks.